And so it's particularly relevant today to think about how do we understand this today? Are we facing a situation where there is a rivalry among great world powers that are trying to once again dominate Africa for their individual interests? Or are we facing a situation where there is a win-win situation going on with some of the Chinese interventions in Africa? And there's certainly a lot of mixed evidence on all of this, and that's what we're going to be examining today. So once again, I want to welcome you to this conference and hope that you will stay for the whole day, enjoy our luncheon with our two distinguished speakers, and then proceed on to the afternoon panels and the final panel at the end. I also want to thank Dr. Kumara, the chair of the Department of African Studies, for the great collaboration that our department, the Department of Economics, has had with the Department of African Studies in co-sponsoring this. And I want to recognize Dr. Alam Hailu in the back as the co-organizer of this, and Dr. Jun Shu, the co-organizer as well. Just raise your hands so we know who you guys are. Okay. So thank you very much, and now I'll turn it over to Dr. Mudibo Kulabale, who will be chairing the first session for you. Dr. Kulabale.
Good morning. We are going to be starting very quick, and like to bring to that issue, which we are really interested in discussing this morning. So I'm going to pass conversation with Lynn, and she's going to start.
Thank you very much for being here. Today I'm going to talk about human capital, and its impact on economic development in Nigeria.
Are we watching this?
Yeah. Nigeria is a big land. It is a big land in Africa. It is located at the center, and it has Cameroon, Chad, Benin, Togo as neighbor. And it has about the population is almost in 2017 almost 200 million inhabitants. It's very big, and the growth rate is 2.47%. So they have a life expectancy of about 53 years. So as you can see, Lagos is one of the largest capitals in Nigeria with almost 12 million inhabitants. Human capital development is strategic, is very important in the socio-economic development of a nation. It refers to the ability, the skills of the human resources. So it's really hard to be it's really important in that aspect. So with human capital development, we can develop many aspects, and it gives a very important condition to sustain the economic growth. And today I focus on two major components, which are education and health. Education is some an aspect in the economy that should be very that should be mentioned, because it helps to make the productivity of the country big, and it accelerates the process of the economy. It has the economy to expand, to be bigger, to be higher. So education education also, have give a way, a mean to find solutions, better solutions for economic problems such as, poverty, unemployment, or another key component of health is key component of development, human capital development is health. So with the increased life expectancy of people and the fertility rate, can go down because of, human capital development. And, the quality of life, people live better, the standard of living is improved due to health. And, it also ensure the economic progress, of the nation. Nigeria has, the growth in Nigeria, the economic growth in Nigeria is improving, but not as it should. We can think about the low capacity of human capital, low capacity of development, human capital in Nigeria. And so the health sector, should be very, we should pay attention to that sector because they are very the quality, the service delivery, the quality is not high, and they have the structure, the institution, which are related to that sector are not really expand at this moment. And when you think about the educational sector too, we see that the schools are overcrowded, in Nigeria. The system is not very efficient. The incentive of the institution and the government, the expenditure for in that sector is not really adequate. And then we see that there is a low student ratio, student teacher ratio. Some statistics show that there's not, Nigeria does not spend a lot, to sector, especially in education. It has, there is 2.7% government expenditure on the health sector, and it was, in 2006, which is still not too big, and we see that, the level of enrollment in primary school was around 12 million in 1980, and it was, in 2010, which is very remarkable, to about 46 million. But the other thing is that, there are around 4 million children in Nigeria who need basic education. So even those, children who can attend primary school just have the basic substandard education. This is a graph that shows, the importance of having healthy kids, having healthy, children. We see that, the outcome. Investing in children health, the outcome, it gives, the cognitive development, and school participation is more beneficial, and it changes the democracy of the country. So the health sector, increase, the propensity of parents to invest in their children. We are more willing, we are more capable, they become more, put their children to get more education and, be healthy, and in order to have, what they need to have one day of the culture of the economy. Because this is the main increase the participation of parents
And that is important. So under 4, and then this is like 4/5, all answers put in. Go to the screen. Email this. I'll go to the email to myself. Go to the screen. Okay. I'll leave it open. The link will be there for anybody else who wants it.
That improve the economic performance, you know, it makes you stronger, it makes you feel, and you reduce the inequality and better distribution of income and the importance of that.
Thanks a lot.
Here are the graphs, statistical graphs. This is the index of human capital in Nigeria. You can see that it was, in 1960, it was a little low in up to 1990. So it went to the very big difference, 2010. So there is a very high in the improvement of the capital, human capital in Nigeria. The next slide is the GDP at national high for Nigeria, and we also see the improvement become higher. We have there is a movement, motion in the economic development. Human capital in Nigeria, which is really good news because they are trying to do their best in order to reach their goal to improve the economy. The next analysis is that we see the fertility when we already know that the fertility when we have an impact on some aspects, and women in Nigeria have the birth of fertility, usually African culture, and the thing that compared to the world in black, Nigeria has the highest, really high the fertility rate, which normally does not help, to focus on, education and health and education and health of the children. And so this is being considered as something to adjust in order to really improve the economy of the country. Another side, that American companies and so that countries. You see how the fertility rate is, and it's very low compared to the other countries. But the good news is that it is improving, as you can see around 2012. Better. They are improving. It's better. And education matters. Education matters because it impacts the economy. Men and women, children who are capable of put their skill and ability to in the country can really be a part of the improvement of the growth of the economy. And we see that Nigeria is doing despite the low rate in some aspects, Nigeria is doing their best to improve because we see that from around 1950 to 2012 or up to now, there are really some aspects that are helping to put human capital. And they have many programs, many pilot programs that help to reach the goal. There is the National Economic Empowerment I believe put in place in Nigeria, which is a plan, to reach around 10% of the required, they want to reach about 10%, of the budget allocated to the education and health of children, and also, they haven't reached that goal, but they are really making real effort, and but you can see that UNESCO they require level is 26%. That with those plans to be placed, I believe there is a hope that the thing will go around. So Nigeria should also improve the information that it gives to families, because children who don't have access to the education content, because sometimes family lack information. And some of the times, the people they don't have, they are not capable of sending their kids to school because of the parents are also illiterate, they don't know, and then so Nigeria needs to put accent on educate men and women in order for them to understand the value of those of those sectors. So I think that people are assets, so and people are not valuable assets in the country. This is why human capital should be really considered as important in order to grow and to get higher opportunities in the country. Thank you.
Thank you. The next presentation is going to talk about China and what you bought.
How's everybody feeling today? Good. Sorry, I have a PowerPoint. My name, like I said, my name is Jonathan Wilson. I'm with the rest of the party. And so in about 2015, I was given the opportunity to travel to Africa as a Fulbright. So I was able to go there for an extended period of time, about 10 months in particular, to teach English. And so while I was there, I was able to, coming there with a Marxist perspective, I was able to not only, put the things that I had read about imperialism and things like that, and actually see them up close and personal. So I've had the opportunity to travel to East Africa as well, and so Chinese development in both of these regions is very different. Whereas in East Africa, it appears that the U.S. imperialism kind of dropped the ball in East Africa a little bit, and so China was able to develop, spend a lot of money in infrastructure development in East Africa, to the point to where now the U.S. is not a major factor in East Africa. In places like Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, one of these places. But however, when you contrast that with West Africa, you see this is where the rubber kind of hits the road, I think, of where you see places of contention for Chinese imperialism and U.S. imperialism. Considering West Africa is a place where the West has kind of got a grip, and it doesn't look like they're willing to give that grip up. So when you look at a place like, so I was in Cote d'Ivoire. I spent my Fulbright time in Cote d'Ivoire, which is so when I talk about West Africa and the West, in particular Francophone West Africa, is a very, very, very interesting place. Considering that France still runs most of its former colonies as if they are still colonies. When I was there, I saw French troops in a tank driving through Cote d'Ivoire. So this is the, to put you all in the mental context of this place. So with that being said, China has to, in Cote d'Ivoire in particular, has to kind of come at a very slow and steady pace. It can't just kind of flood with infrastructure and aid and things like it can with East Africa. And so this takes us back to about 6 or 7 years now. In 2010, 2011, there was a civil war in Cote d'Ivoire. There was a president, Gbagbo, who was, I guess, I would, if I could compare him to someone, I would say more like a Chavez type. So, a president who, wasn't fully, I guess, committed to Marxist principles and things like that, but did offer the population social programs, social relief, and things like that. However, during the presidential election, there was a president also called Water. And so, and this happens in Africa, and this I think also shows how imperialism plays itself out. was a lot of times we have, you probably seen on TV, contested elections, where these elections are very contested. And so what we had in Cote d'Ivoire in 2010, 2011 was a dispute over who won the election. Gbagbo, who was backed by Chinese, imperialist Chinese money and Chinese influence, was the president and did not want to give up that power. Ouattara, who at one point was the president of the IMF. So this kind of shows you where the school of thought he's coming from. A very U.S. French central guy. So a civil war broke out, in which about 4,000 people, between 3,000 and 4,000 people were killed between pro-Gbagbo and pro-Ouattara forces. And I think this is another one of those moments where we saw U.S. and Chinese imperialism come to a head in West Africa in particular, because this was a proxy, in a sense, a proxy between the U.S. and China. And so my observations now, since Gbagbo has been so Gbagbo lost that dispute. He's now being held in French court and being tried for many war crimes in which Ouattara has also, by the population, been accused of as well. But however, since the French and the U.S. won that battle, they decided who the war criminals would be. So now China has kind of taken a more subtle approach to its imperialism in Cote d'Ivoire. I think just last year, it's really weird now how it's formulated. So just last year, they sent about maybe $6 million to build a stadium. So now they're taking a slightly different approach. Now they're building up stores and things like that. So a lot of my friends who I made when I was in Cote d'Ivoire, a lot of them were in a rush to learn English, but not so they can travel to the US or anything like that, but so they can communicate with Chinese, because that's the language that the Chinese use even when they're in Cote d'Ivoire. They don't use French, they use English. So I saw that as being very, very interesting in terms of how Chinese imperialism is starting to develop in the different forms it's beginning to take. Just outside the home where I was living in, like I said, I was in Cote d'Ivoire for about 10 months. And maybe like 2 months before I'm set to leave, it was a big field. It's just been a big field. The kids used to play soccer in that field and everything like that. And about 2 months before I left, I see that the Chinese company has bought this land, and now they're developing on it. And I didn't get a chance to stick around and see what they built. And my French is a little sketchy, so I wasn't, it's sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. So I wasn't able to kind of poke around and ask, what was being developed here. But it's just interesting to see how those things are developing. But I will say that also as I was leaving, you saw political unrest starting to develop in Cote d'Ivoire once again, in which a student group called FESI, which was a student group that was pro-Gbagbo. This was the soft socialist type president who was ousted. It was a student group that kind of supported him. So while I was there, I was able to see that they had kind of been silenced from 2011 until the current, until about 2015 when I was there. They've been silenced. But you kind of were able to see them starting to kind of rev back up. And then they had a big protest, a mass protest, and then the government just outlawed them. Said this group, they hadn't done that before, but after this protest, which was about in January 16, they just outlawed this whole group. And violently repressed them, actually. Ran inside of the dorms and, were, knocking down doors in the dorms and just dragging some of the student leaders out and things like that. And then maybe about a month before I left, it kind of came to a head in which the student group kind of came into full force with the police, like a full force confrontation, where they actually chased the police off the university. So you can see that with FESI growing up and knowing that Gbagbo was backed by the Chinese, and so you can kind of see that I don't think it's hard to put two and two together of who's kind of starting to rev Fessy back up and kind of getting them to kind of go at the president who's for the U.S. So like I said, it's interesting to see how West Africa is kind of playing itself out because, like I said, West Africa is still more so under the thumb of the West, whereas East Africa is a little bit more free reign. And also, I think this is an interesting observation of when we look at Central Africa. So, you know, you have the U.S. here and France and Europe kind of controlling West Africa. And you have China and India to a lesser degree controlling East Africa. And then you have this middle area, right? And so you see that this middle area is where actually a lot of them, the more deadly conflicts are, like Sudan, South Sudan, the Congo, Uganda, Ethiopia, places like this where a lot of more violent repression of the government and things like this is happening, because I think that's actually where the tension between the U.S. and China is most intense, because I think whereas in East Africa and West Africa, it's clear who is the dominant force, and in Central Africa, there is no dominant force. So I think we see that that's where the contention of inter-imperialist rivalry is kind of at its head in Africa, because I think sometimes when imperialists think is if I can't control it, nobody will, so I'll just create chaos in this area for the time. So I think that's what we see in Africa in particular. And so yeah, I'll finish with that. So thank you.
Investment in Africa. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kendrick Hunt. I am currently the High Commissioner for South Africa from Ghana, and also a professor in economics at the College University. So it's a pleasure to be here back home and to share some reflections on some of the things I've seen during my short stay so far in South Africa. I have a short presentation today, and given the theme of today's presentations that you don't look at, I thought of raising a couple of issues, and I was given a short agenda of what I'd like to talk about. So our coach and Monica is going to help me through some of the issues that we have listed. Essentially, when I looked at what the two issues the conference was supposed to address, I said that based on the themes of this conference, I would like to address two questions. Is China repeating the same type of Western colonialism where African renewable and non-renewable resources are confiscated as profits are maximized for the benefit of Westerners in the zero-sum game? That's one of the first questions. And secondly, while moving away from Western colonialism, is there a new approach by China that emphasizes mutual beneficial aid and investment in the win-win outcome for Africa and China together? If this is true, do we have evidence of the success of this new approach? I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about some of these issues today, and I'll go straight to what the observations have been so far, and that's the answer. Which our next slide, it says, yes, China and Africa initially followed the colonialism model, but extracting raw materials and shunning African development. This criticism could be justified based on the early evidence of raw material extraction, low or no value-added production being made or manufactured goods, and the growing trade deficit Africa has with China. And secondly, it says, while the colonial model was and still is enforced by China, could be a possibility, the council stated that China has since moved to a different approach that would foster development in Africa. I contend, however, that it's too early to conclude that this new approach is a success. as more time is needed to evaluate what has been done before and finish that kind of obtained. Basically, my colonial model that I would like to work with today says is about extracting wealth and expanding territory in a zero-sum game of subjugation. That is, when the colonials won, everyone else was defeated and excluded from sharing in progress and development without human dignity and what we call diminished freedoms. Table 1, which I will present shortly, now shows 4 outcomes of the colonial model. Let's take a look. Essentially, I kind of put this in a matrix form. It says you have the colonials and they have a slash China thing. You have win and you have losers in this thing, winners and losers. And I put on the first column on the left, Africa, Caribbean, Asia, because the same model is used in both places. So essentially, if you have like a win-win box in the colonial period, there was no one basically in there. This is where China would like to go. What you would have had as a colonial setup would have been a win for the colonials and a loss for the other countries that were colonized. And that's why I have the zero-sum subjugation operation. The colonials won, Africa, Caribbean, and Asia defeated in that arrangement. What the Chinese are now suggesting in the next slide is that they would like to move to this win-win box that they have on top, which they're saying, look, we're going to go in here and we're going to do things a little differently. And they have come up with a couple of strategies which I'll look at in a few minutes here. But before doing so, let's just refresh some background stuff. Next slide. Africa is a fairly large continent, 55 separate countries, 1.2 billion people live there. Our maps that we normally see doesn't convey that sort of information easily. You have to go digging to get some of it. Interestingly, the landmass of Africa, the continent, includes some of the larger countries in the world, and we fit in there very easily. United States, India, Argentina, Western Europe, and China. I have a little map on the next page which shows you how this would look. You'll see Africa has on top the northern part, the United States could fit there easily, and then we have the whole Western Europe, China at the bottom, Argentina. And then among that, we have space for a lot of other smaller island states that can fit into the continent of Africa to get a sense then how large the continent is. So on the next slide, let me just show you something else. If I were to travel from New York to California, that's roughly 2,413 miles, and that will take me just about 5 hours. If I fly from Georgia to Johannesburg, there's over 8,000 miles, and it takes me 14.5 hours of flying time. If I go from Tunisia up in the north of Africa to South Africa, that takes me 9 hours. So you can get a sense then how large the continent is by seeing some of these things that are out there. That gives you a sense of what's been done. The big problem, one of the big problems in Africa is the colonial legacy, which again is not normally spoken of very easily. First of all, the continent is divided up among these various European relationships in the past. We have 16 countries that are landlocked, that is, they have no access to ports. And I list them here, landlocked countries, Botswana, Burkina Faso, and the one list if you spend up there. There are border controversies, and this is what's kind of critical because if you go to a system in which you can't move freely across space because of all the restrictions and everything else, you have some problems in development. And here, that problem really resulted from since 1844, 1884, 1885, a conference in Bern, Germany, when they divided up Africa. And out of that, we have these strange looking boundaries of countries. They first of all split families up. They took no consideration of the way of life for people and respect for the environment. And they have a map, the next map, which shows you some of the things that they have, this is the type of countries that are out there, everybody know them. The boundary problems you have, which I'll get into a little bit more later on, you'll see from here that some countries are landlocked, Some countries got a lots of resources like fresh water and some do not. Places like Somalia has a big drought at the current time. South Sudan, as you know, there are some serious drought and problems right there. And next to them, you have places where you can have fresh water to do farming agriculture. But again, because of the separation by boundaries and these old colonial borders that were drawn, we have some of the confusion that we see out there. I just mentioned this in passing quickly, but certainly border problems is a major concern of Africa, and that is hindering development. And until we can find a way to redraw some of what the colonials have left, many of these problems will not disappear overnight. Border controversies, and just listen a few here. There are many border controversies among countries. South Africa has border problems with Namibia and Angola over the Orange River. South Africa has location disputes with Swaziland and Lesotho. As you know, those two countries are countries within South Africa. Tanzania and Malawi are in dispute over Lake Malawi, and some of these problems have to do with the use of resources like fresh water or minerals. And again, these are inherited problems from the colonial relationship that were here before. You can see some others, and of course, we have poaching of animals, and that's a major problem. It's a good source for it, it can maintain it properly. Again, water problems affect some of that. The poaching problems, as you know, killing off a lot of rare and very special species of things that we have and should be maintained over time. These are some of what I call some of the concerns. Border problems, if there's a trade, and of course, there's no basic infrastructure. Now, the colonial world was more interested in extracting raw materials and forgetting the people's well-being. Workers' rights and democracy were not an agenda item for Africa. So we have limited education as one particular case, because if you'd like to run a proper system, you have to have educated people that deal with some of these concerns, and that wasn't a major concern at the time. Take the best and brightest, and that's what some of the countries did. Take the best and brightest, and they taught them two major fields, and then they did that joke. We either studied law or medicine, and the reason for that was simple. If I study medicine, I can touch your body and get you back into the field very quickly. And if you study law, I can lock you because I want to maintain the system. And those two took the best brains from many of the poor countries in this system. They never produced people who were doing things like engineering, that looked after mining and things of that sort, because most of those skilled people came from the colony, from the home office. They spent 3-4 years and they did their job and they went home, went back home to Europe. So we never had the kind of levels to build some of these institutions that are required to deal with some of the problems that these places have had. So why is China approach different? What they're saying right now, this happened from in 2015 in Johannesburg, South Africa. At a conference where the president of China was there, President Zuma of South Africa was the person presiding, and of course they have like 40 odd heads of state who attended this conference. Essentially, Chinese were saying, look, we're going to come now and move away from exploitation. We want to move to a win-win situation. So they've been putting together projects. At that particular conference, they raised about, China said they would provide about $60 billion US for investment in Africa. And I listed a few places here where they want to spend those funds. And it's not all loans, some of it is what you call grants and development aid for various things. And I just listed some of them here. Now, some of the key projects they want to work on. And I turn to my next slide and I'll tell you, first of all, is infrastructure. The key infrastructure we want to work on is railways and roads. That's one of the limiting factors in Africa. We don't have lots of good roads to move product and people. Right now in Kenya, they're building railways and they're almost finished in Kenya right now. So you can go from Mombasa to Nairobi in a fairly large, fast train. They're going to use most of the south and middle of Africa, come up from South Africa going up. They're going to be putting in quite a lot of new railway systems. Chinese are providing some of that. And as I mentioned, if you don't have good infrastructure, you can't get around to move forward. There's a lot of difficulties. As you know, the key development change in the United States had to do with railroad. Go back and check. India had the same concern. Those are some of the basic things. If you can't move people on earth and you're landlocked, you will have some difficulties. So in terms of infrastructure, that is a fundamental difference from what has been done before. Education, we're talking about training 200,000 African technical personnel working in various places. Agriculture, we want to do training, again, in various villages, putting funds into that. Clean energy, we're looking at projects in that area. And just list here quickly, projects, African wildlife, create smart sites, trade for aid, some other things that are listed there, which you can see. Now, some projects have already started, such as the railway, as I mentioned, in Kenya, and across the south and west, across this, basically south and east, from Kenya to South Africa. And essentially, one of the problems you have is if you do not find a way to what I call manage and monitor what is taking place, perhaps we could end up back in the same boat that I spoke about earlier of economic arrangement. And just essentially, I don't know if you guys remember a famous phrase, trust and verify, as familiar with President Reagan. That's an old Russian proverb. It says, you deal with, yes, you say you do something, but you have to really find time to verify what is being done. And to be able to do that in Africa, you have to build up institutions, people to learn to manage things properly. One of the things that happens, like for example, if you're going into a raw material type situation, let's say you find that you have an estimate of what's in the ground. And the company says, oh, we have 2 billion barrels of oil here. And everybody gets excited. But nobody kind of monitors what happens over time. Prices change, will change, nobody's there monitoring. So, and then they'll ask for, let's say, a 10-year concession without paying taxes. And if that is done, what the companies usually do, they speed up production and get the output before the 10-year tax holiday is over. So by the time the 10-year tax holiday arrives, there's nothing to worry about. It's all done. The cake is already baked, and you have nothing left. And that's just one example of how that is done. Again, monitoring to be done by the country requires the building of institutions. And if you have that done, that can change some of that on the ground too. Yeah. Now, I just wanted to South Africa. South Africa, you know, is a major player, both on the continent itself and internationally. And I just listed a few things South Africa is involved in as a special country on the continent. As a member of the EU, as you know, the EU now has 55 members. It's a serious player in that particular organization in Ethiopia. The Central Bank of Kenya is now working. Central Bank of Kenya is now working institution in the Reserve Bank in South Africa because they have this risk problems, as you know, movement of money. And many of the big banks in Africa are leaving. Barclays is one of them that was here for years. They're pulling out because of this de-risking issue. So here's South Africa trying to work with some of the other central banks, trying to see what best they can get things done. One of the problems is many countries in Africa don't have a voice or a seat in cases that matter much. Like for example, South Africa has a seat at G20. North African country has that. So we can go there and again represent issues on behalf of the African continent as well as here. You have BRICS, which again, China and South Africa are very close in that relationship, and therefore that strengthens again the role of South Africa in the whole region. We also have then South Africa deals with peacekeeping and peacemaking. They have very large defense force that they help from time to time do other things as well. Again, I just listed a few things here that South Africa is involved in, and they can provide quite a bit of support for what's going on in Africa because they have a seat in some of the major places where decisions are made internationally. So my next slide talks about that, the role of South Africa in this approach. And they had a conference in Johannesburg in South Africa in 2015, where most of this process now with China is going to be moving forward with the amount of money I just mentioned. So we have this conclusion which says The win-win program with China and Africa cooperation is certainly a new approach. It's different from the original colonial model, as it has added components for creating value-added products, skills upgrade the workforce, protecting the environment, enhancing disease control, and eradicating deaths for stock in the area, and improve the transport and energy infrastructure. While this is a commendable start, there is not enough information and performance data available to assess whether or not this win-win that we're talking about has been achieved. It's wise at this time to go find a way in which to measure that performance that they're telling us about. We could include the need to get real-time information. I give the example of the raw materials being exported in there. The extraction rates of raw materials you have to be in a real-time situation to keep track of what's happening. This is important because until Africa can independently measure the use of raw materials from the source, using improved license, transparent and accountable processes, claims of corruption, and all these things will continue. Better governance is needed. We need to be careful with tax-free incentives. I mentioned cases of that before. Raw material use, for example, tax-free years, you've got to look at things like that. And finally, it's imperative that South Africa should be part of the leadership team that is authorized by the AU to oversee this China-Africa win-win program that they're talking about. Thank you very much.
We are going to open for questions. Before we do, I want to just maybe just a few minutes for I think that her presentation about human capital in Nigeria, it would be very interesting if you could add what role Chinese intervention in Nigeria is playing in that human capital development. Has it been positive before? I think that would strengthen the presentation, which I found that to be very informative. The second observation I had about the Chinese approach in Africa and whether that is different from the European colonial model is this. What we do usually when we define economic development, we do not define actually what exactly is that. What is that we developing? You see, what is not said in this, the goal is really growth. Growth. That is the bigger, the better. And basically, economic, if we look at it that way, the purpose is really about growth. Ultimately, we can begin to kind of assess in the right way whether the European colonial model is different from the Chinese. Because why are we developing infrastructure to do what? Ultimately is for growth. And this is the issue I want to put to all of you to think about, because sometimes we talk about certain things and we don't really stop and think too much about it. Since the beginning of the capitalist development, the objective is really growth and and profit. So if you really see that ultimately that's where we're going, whether I take a straight or whether I take this road or that road, if that ultimately where we are ending up. That's one thing to see if actually these things. One factor to use to see actually these are different approaches. Maybe they are, the form is different, but the ultimate contents of this are the same. And I can give just one example of minimal extraction in West Africa. I see there are cases of Chinese buying a great amount of land in Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, or Senegal, and some other places where there are fresh water and the land is really fertile for development. Basically, when those land are purchased or leased by the Chinese, and there is some kind of agricultural development. At least the anecdotal complaint I'm hearing from many involved in this project is that they do not really benefit that much local population. And most of these are either exported to China or used by China to be exported in other countries, especially the United States and Western European market. Because one of the problems that the U.S. and Africa during the Obama administration, one of the things they were trying to do was to actually open the U.S. market to African agricultural products. And one of the technical stumbling block was, okay, how do we do this so that countries like India or China would now use Africa at the transit point, basically develop these agricultural products like cotton and in Mali and sell it duty free to the US. So the only the only thing I want to raise here is it's not that the presentation, and I think that Dr. Hunt's presentation is very, very informative. And he has really some really important questions that he's raising. And one of the things I want all of you to start thinking about when you hear words, try to see what they really mean and try to dig in a little. For all of my years as a student, undergraduate, and graduate, I hear economic development, and basically I take it for granted. This is good. It's like in the United States, economic growth is supposed to be taken for granted and it's good. The growth, but take a look at it. Actually, is this really as good as they think? And when we look at some of the terms that are thrown around, like most advanced countries, well, they are advancing only, they are the most advanced in only one area, consumption. They're not more advanced in terms of culture. They're not more advanced in terms of the way people live. And in fact, one of the problems in Africa, and this may be a collateral damage caused by the Chinese intervention, is that when these technology and these development is brought, Africa is now beginning to be the recipient of waste, industrial waste. And also through what economists call the trickle down. Basically, all of these outdated or old and used up products in the West are dumped in Africa. And that's not without the complicity of African leaders. And I see something in this country, for instance, the movement for going green eating things that are healthy, less chemical. But all of these used to be abundantly available in Africa, but they've been all destroyed. The ecosystem is being destroyed by these industries that are now bringing these chemicals, bringing all of these, industrial type of waste. And sometimes, because the government in these countries are so weak, they cannot police these industries as US government or European government can. So basically, it's really destroying what used to be actually our natural resource. That is a natural, chemical-free food, natural chemical-free water. Now that is beginning to be difficult. And fishing is one area where China is also involved in West Africa. And again, you have this problem where it's creating some collateral damage. So when we're talking about economic development, let's stop and think about what we need. Thank you. Questions?
Sorry.
Talk about how has Chinese investments impacted true growth and development throughout Africa. This special study will analyze the question as to whether Chinese engagement has contributed to economic growth in Africa, or has such other factors such as improvement to institutions, infrastructure, and decreased conflict also contributed to positive growth rates. To date, 86% of all economic growth in Africa hovers around mineral resources. Africa has indeed benefited from the Chinese economic boom through increased trade, mainly in the natural resources sector. Currently, China imports 1/3 of its oil from Africa, and some of its investments are tied to resource extraction. Nations such as Nigeria, Angola, trade their natural resources for infrastructure development. So what does this mean, infrastructure development? It means railways, it means ports, it means roads, it means telecommunications, capacity, information technology, etc. All things that will support long-term GDP growth in time to come. The Chinese economy has rapidly modernizing industries. This creates an opportunity for Africa. As incomes rise in China, the Chinese will look for an arbitrage opportunity to move their factories and low-tech industries someplace else, where Africa would be ideal. So what's driving the new Silk Road to Africa? Well, since 2006, China's production sector was at overcapacity. So the central government was forced to look for new markets for their goods. Also, China's one belt, one road neo-mercantilist philosophy is to accumulate as much wealth and capital for their nation. Also, there's opportunity in Africa. The Chinese is currently Africa's largest trading partner. The Chinese have a philosophy of harmonization. If you look at this this slide right here, you will see that China-Africa bilateral trade, where the exports and imports of Chinese goods and services is almost 50-50, which supports this ancient Chinese philosophy of harmonization and balance. So let's debunk myth versus reality. The Chinese have drawn criticism by some other nations, saying that they've supported countries with low governance, such as the Sudan, Angola, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. However, the Chinese has also supported countries and financed countries with good governance, such as South Africa, which goes back to this Chinese philosophy of harmonization. The media portrays China's involvement in Africa as enormous and potentially overwhelming the continent. However, the Ministry of Commerce and the World Bank has published that China's foreign direct investment was only $32 billion in 2014, which is only 5% of the total foreign investment on the continent. The Export-Import Bank of China has only provided 16.67% of their external loans to fund infrastructure projects. The third grievance, Chinese businesses are hurting the economy. Indeed, there is a trade deficit. Chinese imports exceed exports. And in some cases in West Africa right now is currently experiencing a large trade deficit with China. However, there are some African nations such as Burkina Faso, Chad, Mauritania have registered trade surpluses. Some economists argue that Africa is completely exposed to an economic shock should the Chinese face some sort of economic recession. However, in my opinion, I disagree. I think there will be a continuous and ongoing need for mineral resources in the long term, whether China is in a recession or not. The Chinese focus is a one belt, one road strategy of developing roads, railways, ports, building factories, infrastructure, telecommunication capacity, information technology. It is preparing Africa to compete in the global market. Whether China is in a recession or not, the African nation can redirect their exports to other countries and other emerging economies, such as India. Another grievance is that Chinese companies refuse to hire Africans. Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, their China-Africa Research Initiative, has studied this issue and found not one case where Chinese firms did not hire local workers at all. There are some barriers and some obstacles that the Chinese are facing, primarily the lack of skilled labor. Also, in countries such as Angola, that has endured decades of civil war, finding skilled personnel in civil engineering and computer programming and information technology is scarce and very expensive. But there are some real issues. As I aforementioned, some of the real major issues to Africa's continued sustained growth currently is semi-developed infrastructure and inadequate skilled labor. But there are some opportunities. China supporting Sudan and Angola will miss opportunities for them to emerge as a real world power as they build their second aircraft carrier. There's agreements that the Chinese firms are doing business in Africa and practicing unfair trade policies, not transferring technical knowledge. The Chinese have heard this call and have pledged to train 200,000 professionals and have also agreed to exchange 40,000 personnel directly to China to train to repatriate back to Africa. There is a trade imbalance in West Africa. In 2009 through 2012, West Africa's trade deficit was 13% of their GDP. However, some countries, such as Burkina Faso, Chad, Mauritania, and Angola, have enjoyed trade surpluses. But there are some problems which creates this trade deficit. Less than ideal market conditions, business environment, corruption, lack of competitiveness in the market structure, the quality of their institutions, skill shortages, all of these will have to be overcome. Also, the African nations will have to adopt trade protectionist philosophies to protect their local economy from these imported Chinese goods. Even still, with all these unintended consequences, as you can see, 1/3 of non-oil producing countries are experiencing an average GDP growth rate of 4.5%. And 1/5 of the population of non-oil countries have a GDP growth rate of roughly 3%. From 2000 to 2014, the Chinese government and their banks have invested $86.3 billion worth of loans to African governments. Angola received the largest percentage at 25%. Ethiopia, Sudan, Kenya, the DRC have all received very large foreign direct investments. The top 5 African destinations for foreign direct investment in 2014 is Algeria, Zambia, Kenya, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Nigeria. Algeria alone accounts for 20% of all Chinese foreign direct investment. Between 2009 and 2012, China's direct investment in Africa grew at an annual rate of 20.5%. These figures do not reflect the investments from private firms, small investors, or the acquisition of assets that may have taken place in other jurisdictions, such as the acquisition of ADIX for $7 billion, which is headquartered in Switzerland, which owns many African properties and assets. So what is China's impact on Africa? Well, China has impacted Africa's middle class, job growth, has helped to stabilize institutions, has helped to create infrastructure. Currently, the One Belt, One Road initiative has provided more opportunities for Africa. While other nations have imposed conditions before aid is given, China's relationship with African countries will no longer be strictly a business one. Many Chinese firms are building infrastructure, factories, telecommunications capacity all over the continent, which will fuel long-term growth. The average GDP is 4.5% annually. There's a growing middle class. There's African professionals who are being trained professionally abroad and are repatriating back to their homeland because there's job opportunity. Chinese investment in telecommunications, infrastructure, the technical exchange, training has improved fragile institutions immensely, especially in places such as Angola. Some other areas that China's impact in Africa has been in modernization and security. China has built the African Union headquarters in Ethiopia for the amount of $200 million. China has pledged $100 million to maintain and stand up the African Union Army and pledged $1 billion to establish the UN's Peace Development Trust Fund. President Jinping has also pledged to take a more hands-on approach to conflict wherever it may exist in Africa. There are some consequences, however. For example, inflation. Some places, such as West Africa and other parts of Africa, has endured Dutch disease, which has a negative impact on the economy when you have a large inflow of currency coming in, which affects the price of local goods. Also, there has been sustained interest in China's role as an overseas agricultural investor. From 2000 to 2014, the Chinese have acquired 239 million hectares of land in 21 countries. Cameroon alone accounts for 43% of all accumulated land actually acquired by China. South Africa is experiencing a tourism boom. So there are some opportunities. There's some opportunities for Africa that China has provided. As the Chinese attempt to go global, they will look for an arbitrage opportunity to set up factories in other countries with lower wages, and Africa will be ready for this. The Chinese One Belt, One Road strategy emphasizes industrialization in addition to infrastructure, which is exactly what many African nations are aiming to do. China's involvement now has taken the security dimension to protect its citizens, its assets in places such as Sudan and Libya. China has provided $100 million in free assistance to the African Union to build, maintain, and equip its army. Technical exchange. President Jinping announced a forum of China-Africa cooperation to invest $60 billion in foreign direct investment to build and upgrade industrial parks throughout Africa, train 200,000 African specialists, and absorb 40,000 trainees in China. To maintain this growth that Africa is experiencing, the sub-Saharan African nations will have to improve their governance through reduction of corruption, greater transparency, accountability for public officials, the ongoing and continuing improvement and modernization of their institutions. In conclusion, China's new Silk Road, One Belt, One Road economic strategy is good for Africa. The Chinese African investment policy has had a significant positive effect. The impact of a Chinese economic slowdown is negligible, as Africa will have infrastructure, the ability to transport its goods and services, and redirect them to other nations. China's commerce with Africa is opening the way for Africa to become a processor of goods and services and be competitive in the global market.
questions?
Yes, I can't. Is there any? Oh, no, I'm sorry. Thank you guys so much for your presentation this morning. My name is Jackson Miller. I'm a researcher. This question is primarily directed towards Your Excellency. Obviously, the subtitle of this conference highlights China and the West and economic interventions, but of course we have to honor the diversity that's always been present across the African continent, you know, for the past 10 years. With that said, this past week we honored the 100th anniversary of the abolition of the system of indenture that essentially brought in 1.2 million Indian laborers around the world. And given your Guyanese heritage, right, with this, along with your position in South Africa, two key recipient countries of Indian labor at that time. From your experiences on the ground, what is your take? And I know this question, apologies for overgeneralizing, but what is your take on how these Indian populations on the African continent, particularly in South Africa, are sort of socially locating themselves vis-a-vis this sort of massive influx of Chinese and also Western economic and political pivots?
Thanks very much for your question. As you know, people's come to the party long before Ghani was there. Ghani was there. They are more or less integrated into the South African economy. They're doing various things. In urban, one example, they're a fairly large during industry. They're doing that type of thing because the goal in doing purposes of ourselves. We're integrated too in some of the manufacturing components, especially to, I should say, IT. South Africa has a large IT industry. We're working in that sector, and we have lots of private businesses here too as well. In discussing at the institutional level, many of them too are involved in academia. They are part of the governmental system. We work with what we call the equivalent of the Department of State. There is the Department of International Cooperation. They do lots of the international relationship work out of the organization called DERCA. And DERCA is I have not yet had a chance at a cultural level to meet with some of the Indians who are involved in the cultural aspects. But one of Land's group and others here, which he maintains some of his work as part of the cultural description out in Johannesburg, where she is right now. So when I look across the board, they are part of the system in South Africa. His involvement, as I mentioned, they're doing some infrastructure work, some things in health, and some other things in health. I can see there is a blending of knowledge and exchange of ideas. And of course, we mentioned Guyana. We have Chinese as well, because Chinese doing Guyana for 100 years too, as part of the colonial system. So I'm familiar with all of that particular system. I've answered the question.
All right, I'm sorry, we ran out of time. This is, please join me to thank all the presenters.
Let's give another round of applause to the panel. Thank you. I wanted to thank Dr. Hunt, who was able to join us at the last minute when one of our other presenters was not able to join us. And I think he brought this whole session with real highlights. So thank you in particular. And I also want to thank Jonathan Wilson, who also joined us at the last minute to help us make sure this is a full panel with diverse points of view. What I'd like to do right now is ask Dr. Kamara to come up and say a couple of words. I unfortunately was looking out this way, and he was sitting over there when I first introduced this. So Dr. Kamara, please come on up. He's the chair of the African Studies Department at the relatively new Howard.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. I would like first to say that on behalf of the Department of African Studies, I'd like to welcome you to this conference, which I am confident will go into the history of our university as a groundbreaker. And we are proud as a department to be co-organizers of this conference because its purpose is in line with the vision that guides the department, which is contributing to maintaining our university as the place where scholars, policymakers, and other stakeholders can meet and reflect on Africa. And certainly we know when we talk about reflecting on Africa, it's a tall order because of the size and diversity of Africa in all different considerations. However, looking at the topics that your 5 panels are going to be discussing throughout the day, and the profiles of the scholars that will be coming up here and examining these topics, scholars from around the world. I am proud to be part of this department, this institution, and one of the co-organizers, or whose department is a co-organizer. Africa has been dubbed the new investment frontier of the world economy, if not the new frontier of the global political economy. That comes with advantages. It also comes with challenges. And I believe one of the challenges for us as scholars is to try to understand Africa, to try to understand, if you allow me to say, the Africans in the diversity of the continent. And really at a certain point to find a way to understand Africa's problems and challenges rather than define Africans to themselves, rather than defining Africa's problems to Africa, because usually when we define somebody's problems, we are thinking about defining their solutions. And we know Africa has gone through centuries of slave trade, during which Africa was defined to itself one way or the other. And it has gone through around a century of colonialism, in which Africa's problems were defined by others. And in the post-colonial era, Africa has gone through the mirage of industrialization and modernization of the 50s and 60s. Didn't work. And then the militarization of the state under the wing of Cold War policies in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It didn't work. And then the structural adjustment programs of international financial institutions of the 80s and 90s didn't work. Post-Cold War era, we're talking about global free trade in a hugely asymmetrical system, whereby Africa is important because it has almost every single strategic mineral that the world needs. And I'm confident that this conference will help us understand these and other related issues. And because of that, I would like, again, on behalf of the Department of African Studies, to thank the organizers, including Dr. Green and Dr. Hailu, for taking the lead in organizing this conference. Unfortunately, I won't be able to attend the rest of the conference because we have some data to put together by the end of this day. So please, again, thank you, welcome, and thank you.
Okay, so now we're ready to move on to the second panel, so you guys can take a break. And the other panelists could please come forward now. Our first panelist is from Hong Kong and was unable to get leave from his university, so he's going to be, we hope, Skyping in for the first presentation. And so after that, we will have Dr. Anthony O'Brien from Department of King's College, and then his son Walker from Maastricht University. As our panelists for the second session.
Yes.
Sharing some feedback with Dr.
Okay, yeah, I can. We have a mini. Okay, yeah, I can help. Yes. I think I did. Yes, for the. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
They're having a little trouble with the Skype thing. They have him on, but there's no sound.
Oh, okay.
Maybe you could
I
help
haven't
him.
turned it on. I didn't turn it on.
Next time we'll have to. Yeah, I was just,
It's on. It's on.
So now we just need to get it on the screen, right?
Oh.
I don't, I know nothing about this stuff, so.
Yeah, the guy from.
You can come out of my audio, record out one side or both sides.
Yeah.
Using your timer.
Oh, okay, great. I'm gonna check them all.
Right.
Okay. Have farmers like. Yeah, no, it's good. It's the table is a little.
I don't know that when I came out, I just I had it on. I didn't see you.
Yes,
Yeah, I did.
so you can hear me now?
You need
Okay,
it.
so I turn it down on my side?
You need it for.
Okay.
Quarter, I mean, RC. Oh, you have one. Yeah, oh, hey, JJ. Yeah, good. Just in time. Okay. So it's already check the Skype for you. They agree to do the Skype.
Okay, so I
Oh,
switch
yeah, this
up
one.
my PowerPoint now. Okay, and you can see my PowerPoint okay?
I can I only have one.
Oh, you only have one. Why don't you come over, JJ? Excuse yourself. I'll get your chair. I gotta get
So,
it.
you can see my PowerPoint, and people can also see me, or just the PowerPoint.
You can go tell, but
Okay, I think we're about ready to get back underway. If someone could mention to people that we're going to start in about 30 seconds, would be good.
if you
Ask you to come in from out. Thank you.
if you got a quarter, I can come out quarter out of the monitor out.
Okay, we're going to start with Dr. Salas from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. We're going to be talking to him via Skype. He's got his PowerPoint up, so go ahead, Harry, take it away.
Thanks very much. Well, as you can see, I'll be talking about the nature of the Chinese presence in Africa. Thus far, a lot of people, including myself, have looked at what China is not doing in Africa in response to claims that China was either purporting to be a agent of development and only that, or that China was operating in a neo-colonial fashion in Africa. So after many years of doing research about Chinese presence in Africa, myself and my co-researcher, Yan Haiwen, have decided to try to characterize the Chinese presence in Africa, at least in terms of investment. So that's what I'll be talking about now. Well, Western elites ran Chinese activity in Africa as neo-colonialist, even though there's no real correspondence between historically practiced colonialism and what China and Chinese entities are doing in Africa at present. These elites seek to tap into the anti-colonialism that has been widespread in the developing world, and they aim to marginalize the Chinese presence that Western states see as strategic competition. When China was a revolutionary country, Chinese revolutionaries aided the anti-colonial struggle, but they doubted that nationalists could be consistently anti-imperialist. Many nationalists indeed were disappointing to them in terms of the struggle against imperialism. But more recently, Chinese leaders have claimed that they seek to promote South-South solidarity with these very nationalists. So the question is, how does Chinese capital and how do Chinese people interact with people in other developing countries, particularly in Africa? We argue that the Chinese presence has marginal departures from the practices of mainstream Western capitalism. First of all, the Chinese investment in the world and in Africa is marginal compared to Western countries. Second, that Chinese investment comports with the neoliberal global order but it challenges it at the margins, and at least it challenges some local level monopoly practices. And then third, that the China-Africa discourse, which is Western directed, focuses on the most marginal Chinese operations, and it invokes these operations to put forward a yellow peril trope of Chinese as threatening. First, the question of Chinese investments at the margin, in terms of Chinese investments in the world at large. Chinese firms own much less abroad than their Western counterparts. The stock of China's global outbound foreign direct investment in 2014 was about $1 trillion US, but that was only 3.3% of all global OFDI, and it was less than the UK's or France's, and much less than the United States' share, which was 20%. China's stock of OFDI in Africa in 2014 was 4% of all of China's stock of investment outside of China. China's OFDI stock in Africa in 2014 was $32 billion, and that amounted to only 4.5% of all the OFDI in Africa. As you can see, the UK's OFDI was larger than China's, so was the US and France's. China's OFDI flow to Africa, that is the annual flow of investment going from China to Africa in 2015, was 2% of China's global OFDI flow. And it was less than 3% of the whole world's OFDI flow to Africa. So China is not catching up with Western countries in terms of its investment in Africa. 90% of global investment in Africa is also in natural resources, but China's share of its OFDI stock in Africa, that is in extractive industry, was only 31%. Chinese firms own fewer oil blocks, less profitable mines compared to Western firms. Many Chinese investments are marginal in their sectors, that is, they are less endowed, they are less productive, and they are less profitable. China is certainly entangled in the liberal world order, but it does have some principles that the West does not adhere to. For example, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which I've listed in PowerPoint. 4 no's, that is the idea of no hegemony, no power politics, no military alliances, and no arms race. Well, compare those to, for example, the stance of the United States in the world. A debate exists over China's role in the neoliberalist capitalist world economy, but as Art Gillick has said, that even if China keeps neoliberalism at arm's length, China's successes and problems are attributable to its successful manipulation of the neoliberal global economy. The various ideas that are circulated around the world and attributed to China are by and large non-official policies. The Beijing Consensus, China Model, the Chinese Path, these are all notions of academics rather than the official policy of China. China's initiatives, for example, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the One Belt, One Road initiative, are in fact efforts to counteract U.S. hostility to China's increasing profile within the neoliberal global order. The best push to marginalize China relates to a key difference with the Washington Consensus. That is, China does not insist that African states privatize and adopt neoliberal small government, big market principles. Yet Chinese firms, of course, don't hesitate to take advantage of opportunities that are created when African states do adapt such neoliberal measures. At local levels in Africa, Chinese activities do marginally differ from Western counterparts. And this is, in effect, the essence of our argument. Chinese actions may depart from practices of Western governments, Western transnational and large local firms, in terms of monopolies and profit maximization. We've done field work in about a dozen African countries, and I'll concentrate on a couple of examples from Southern Africa, from Zimbabwe and Zambia. Beginning first by talking about Tianza, which is a subsidiary of the China Tobacco Company, the largest tobacco company in the world. It's been operating in Zimbabwe since 2005. and it broke the monopoly of the Western tobacco merchants that had fixed prices. Also, Tianza aids black farming in Zimbabwe. Before Zimbabwe's independence, only whites were allowed to grow commercial crops. And in 2000, there were 7,000 tobacco farmers, and almost all of them were white. Black farmers got land after 1999, and now there are about 80,000 tobacco farmers. But the white tobacco merchants refused to deal with the new black farmers, and these merchants fixed low prices for tobacco. In addition, of course, there was the US-UK boycott of Zimbabwe after white farmers' land was taken away, and this, of course, hurt the new farmers. Now, the Chinese government incentivized Tianza to go to Zimbabwe in 2005 and begin to do contract farming. Tianza provided the first interest-free loans, mainly to new farmers, and it bought their crops. Tianza paid higher tobacco auction prices than other firms fixed, thereby breaking their monopoly. The non-Chinese tobacco firms, in fact, threatened Tianza's managers physically and used thugs to try to attack them. But Tianza remained in the country and has expanded since then. It partnered with local tobacco merchants to do the first contract farming with small farmers in Zimbabwe. These are farmers who have less than 1 hectare of land. And it provided training to new farmers to help restore tobacco production to almost the level before the Western boycott of Zimbabwe began. Tianza's managers and managers of Zimbabwe-China joint venture farm have disavowed profit motive, and they have framed as their political goals the restoration of Zimbabwe's tobacco industry and food production. I'll now talk about an example from the neighboring country of Zambia. Another Chinese activity in Africa that marginally diverges from neoliberal practices is a project that Chinese in Zambia and the Zambia Cooperative Federation developed to change Zambian agriculture. They are supplying solar-powered mills to grind maize into mealie meal, which is a powder that is Zambia's staple food. The mills are being developed to deploy to primary level cooperatives, and these primary level cooperatives sell mealie meal at lower prices than those charged by the conventional millers and retailers in Zambia. 2,000 mills were bought from China using a loan from the China Development Bank that went to Zambia's government, that is the GRZ, which transferred the funds to the ZCF at no interest. ZCF now loans the money to the village cooperatives. The village cooperatives buy maize from their members, making a profit by selling the mealie meal, and then repaying their loans for the mills. With the solar mills, no electricity is needed, and there are no big transport costs. And this allows for the distribution of much cheaper mealie meal to the Zambian general population. After the International Monetary Fund ordered privatization in Zambia in the late 1990s, milling was in the hands of the monopoly that fixed the price of mealie meal. High prices created a crisis, and then the Zambian government had to go into the milling business using solar mills. This idea was suggested by a leading Chinese in Zambia, and a Chinese mining company, CNMC, built the first solar mill using a combination of Chinese and Zambian engineers. The Zambian president then set up a deal during a trip to China, and he now has his own presidential milling initiative. This project is not without problems, however, and the main problem is the need to mobilize farmers to join a cooperative and sell their maize to that cooperative. The GRZ, the Zambian government, says it will supply these solar mills with maize that it buys, but there's a real question about how reliable the Zambian government will be. In any case, this solar mill project exemplifies how Chinese entities operating still within a neoliberal African economy, where local and foreign entities partner with and generally defer to monopoly power, can make use of Chinese government resources to challenge monopoly at the margins. There are some other examples of differences at the margins that I'll just mention very briefly in terms of Chinese investment in Africa. The entry of Chinese companies in Africa has broken monopolies of Western and large local firms in several industries besides agriculture. For example, in telecommunications, Chinese companies have brought down prices and created a high level of cell phone use. With regard to media, they provided counterpoints to Western domination of the news and other media. With regard to credit cards and credit ratings, Chinese firms have broken the monopoly of Western companies. In construction, there's no longer a necessity to rely only on European and white South African firms to do large-scale infrastructure projects. In retailing, there's some competition offered to the virtual monopoly of white South African chain stores in many African countries. Other policies on the part of Chinese companies that differ from the conventional policies include the 3 No's policy in Zambia during the global financial crisis. This was a policy of the main Chinese mining company in Zambia during the midst of the global financial crisis to have no layoffs, no scaling back expansion, and no reluctance to make plans to expand. Of course, this was a state-owned Chinese enterprise, and that's why it could do what it did. In South Sudan during the civil war, ongoing civil war, in West Africa during the Ebola crisis a couple years back, in Ghana during a recent economic crisis, Chinese companies remained when other firms cut back or left the country. Chinese SOEs and private-owned enterprises recognize relevant political factors, and they seek to align their goals with those of the Chinese and African governments. The Chinese government has also said it will punish Chinese firms that violate African states' laws. An example of this is the infamous shooting that occurred by threatened Chinese supervisors at Zambia's Column coal mine. This is a privately owned mine in Zambia. And when that shooting occurred in 2010, the Chinese embassy had the bosses of the Column coal mine do public self-criticisms, criticize themselves in front of the miners, and criticize themselves in front of the Zambian public, and criticize themselves in front of the people from other Chinese-owned enterprises in Zambia. Western governments generally do not police the activities of private companies that go abroad, however. For example, leading Swiss commodity trading firms sell toxic Africa quality fuels in Africa with 100 times the sulfur level allowed in Europe, and yet they go without criticism, let alone supervision, from the Swiss government. Well, the Western China and Africa discourse focuses on the most marginal Chinese firms as exemplifying all Chinese enterprises in the continent. And it depicts Chinese activity as a whole as a kind of yellow peril that Africans and the world must beware of. Chinese firms, in fact, have mostly marginal mines and oil blocks, but the most marginal of all has been the Column coal mine, which I referred to earlier. And everything about the Column coal mine was bad. Its coal quality, its geology, its market, its labor relations, its environmental practices, however, also. The Western media, in its China and Africa discussions, highlighted the 2010 confrontation between the Column coal mine miners, who pursued and stoned Chinese supervisors over a wage dispute, and the 2 Chinese supervisors who then panicked and wounded a dozen miners. The same thing was true with regard to a murder by miners of a Chinese engineer in a riot at the Column coal mine in 2012. Western media depicted this as a just response to actions by the Chinese, but it was in fact a misunderstanding about whether a wage increase was to be paid that day. So this is an example where the most marginal of marginal enterprises by Chinese is constantly talked about in the Western media and is said to exemplify what Chinese companies do generally in Africa. And the media in this case ignore that the main column coal mine owner is in fact an Australian citizen, although of Chinese descent. And that the column coal mine has no parent company in China. That is, it was established by people who have lived in Zambia for a long time and was established as a Zambian company. This kind of discourse again invokes the yellow peril theme of Chinese as cruel with no regard for life. Western media discourses about Africa thus implicitly seek to vindicate Western states, Western institutions, and the neoliberal ideology that originated in the West. So, in conclusion, our argument is that there are two fundamental illusions about the Chinese presence in Africa. The first illusion is that China is neo-colonialist. And this is so far from the truth that it must reflect a political agenda. The second illusion is that China is an opponent of and alternative to imperialism and neoliberalism. This second illusion, to our way of thinking, is a kind of clutching at straws. Because of the decline of the former revolutionary movement in the world, there's been no sustained, effective global anti-imperialist or anti-neoliberal movement. So some people will turn to China as a possible leader of such a movement. This, we think, is an illusion. China holds those elements of neoliberalism that facilitate the liberalization of China's economy and that advance China's global trade and OFDI. China is contributing to African industrialization and agriculture, but it is certainly not working to help free Africa from neoliberal domination. China certainly is a weighty country in the world, and it can work at the margins on issues involving developing countries' subordination. China also has a huge working class, the largest working class in the world. And the working class is usually more democratic and more egalitarian than the middle class. But for the time being, at least, China will mainly continue to talk the talk, but not walk the walk on imposing imperialism and neoliberalism. So that's my very quick summary of a very long paper. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Barry. Since you're visiting us via Skype, I thought instead of waiting till the end of the whole session, maybe we could take a couple of questions now, so you don't have to stay online too long.
Thanks, that's very, very generous, because here it's after 11 o'clock, and I don't know when the buses stop running, so thank you very much.
Okay, so do we have some questions for Dr. Sutton? Yes.
I have a question about the statistics in terms of the foreign direct investment. You said that the numbers were very low, but I was interested in the trends. So, I mean, those numbers are increasing, and at what rate are they increasing?
Did you hear that,
If
Barry?
I heard you right, you were asking about the rate of increase of Chinese investment in Africa, right?
Yes.
Thanks. The rate of investment of Chinese, the rate of increase of Chinese investment in Africa was very considerable, I think, from a very low starting point during the 2000s. That is, if you look at the first decade of the 21st century, then certainly the rate of increase was very large. But again, beginning from almost no investment in Africa at all at the beginning of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century. But in more recent years, there has been a slowing of the rate of increase of investment, in part because a lot of Chinese companies have shifted much of their OFDI flow away from Africa and away from other parts of the developing world to, not surprisingly, the United States, which is now the most favored country in terms of the flow of Chinese investment. That doesn't mean that there isn't a steady increase in the amount of Chinese investment in Africa, but as I indicated, the gap between the level of Western investment in Africa and the level of Chinese investment in Africa is no longer closing. In fact, the gap between the two is now widening. At least it's been widening in the last couple of years, in 2015 and 2016. And I expect that to continue for some time to come.
Other questions for Dr. Salmon? I guess you convinced everybody. Any other questions?
No, I doubt that. My pleasure.
Other comments or questions on various presentations? Yes.
It's interesting that you say that China has the largest working class and it's more democratic and egalitarian than its middle class. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that.
Well, again, if I heard you right, you noted that I said that China has the largest working class in the world, and that workers tend to be more democratic and egalitarian than the middle class does. Well, it's not my original research that shows that workers are more egalitarian and more democratic than the middle class. There have been several studies by other political scientists which have shown this, and these have been in various national settings, some in Asia, some in developed countries in Europe, etc., and in various parts of the world. And virtually every survey shows this to be the case. Of course, as I mentioned, China has a huge working class, and this huge working class is still growing by leaps and bounds. And the Chinese working class, in fact, if you define it in the classic industrial terms, is not only the largest working class in the world, but it pretty much adds up to the whole rest of the working class of the world. And that's because, of course, China has become a thoroughly industrialized country. And that means that in terms of improving, for example, the working conditions and the position of the working class in the world at large, it's absolutely necessary to make contacts and bring about solidarity between the Chinese working class and the rest of the workers throughout the globe. And this is particularly true, I think, where Chinese investment is taking place in Africa. There's only the very beginnings of that happening in African settings, but it's entirely possible that more could be done in this regard, and that a more developed solidarity can take place.
Yes, Michael?
So I'm by no means very knowledgeable in China, but I was a little surprised when you had mentioned the labor practices, environmental practices, the higher things in leader. When I go to China, I think clouds factory, I think huge swaths of tech industry. I'm wondering, why is China more respectful of a lot of tech? What is the essence of the game? What is the incentive?
I'm sorry, I missed most of what you said. If there's somebody who's closer to the mic there, maybe you could just summarize what the question was.
He's coming to the microphone.
Okay, thanks.
So I'm not terribly knowledgeable on China, but when I think about Chinese labor practices and environmental practices, I think of things like Foxconn and huge swaths of pollution in northern China in the tech industry. So I was surprised when you mentioned that they're more respectful of the local laws in Africa than Western nations. Could you explain, does China have something to gain from being more respectful? Where exactly is this coming from not being as imperialist as other countries?
Well, I don't think Chinese companies are necessarily more respectful of local laws, and particularly not more respectful of local labor laws. But what our argument is not that Chinese companies have an instinct to be better capitalists or that sort of thing. Rather, it's that for political reasons, the Chinese government polices its state-owned enterprises particularly, but also its private-owned enterprises that invest in Africa to a larger extent than is done by Western governments, or by governments more generally from countries which have companies that come to Africa to set up shop. So the Chinese government, I think, is acutely aware of the fact that it needs the support of the 55 African countries. In fact, Chinese scholars, people like Dian Shan at Beijing University, have said over and over again that China needs Africa more than Africa needs China. And for that reason, the Chinese government is acutely aware that it has to police the activities of its companies operating in Africa in a way that's not done by the governments of other countries. And that's, of course, a long-term advantage to those companies, even if they have the short-term viewpoint that they should maximize their exploitation of the workers that they employ. Nevertheless, there's going to be problems which will rise to a political level necessarily in African states, and that the Chinese government will have to address those problems. And the second factor that's important in this regard is precisely the China and Africa discourse, which is in effect an effort on the part of Western political elites and Western media to paint China and Chinese in these yellow peril terms that I described. And as long as that ongoing, basically racist campaign against Chinese is being carried out from the West, then the Chinese government has to be careful to ensure that the image of China is protected in Africa and internationally. So it's not out of the goodness of their hearts on the part of Chinese officials, but rather for something that has a practical political consequence for China and for Chinese.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Okay, one last question, and then we'll move on.
Barry, this is Jama. Can you tell me what egalitarianism looks like in an authoritarian state?
Did you hear that, okay, Gary?
So, sorry, I couldn't hear that.
He asked, what does egalitarianism look like in an authoritarian state?
Yeah, well, what it looks like is not something that's directly related to liberal democracy or authoritarianism per se. That is, if you look at the views of people in this society or that society about how much they want society to be equal, you will find that there's different levels of people's conceptions in terms of egalitarianism, particularly with regard to matters like wealth and income. Now, actually, if you look at surveys taken in the United States, a country where anti-egalitarianism is taught to people from the first day that they go to school, nevertheless, the majority of people in the United States have fairly egalitarian ideas in terms of the distribution of wealth, of income, and even of political power. But that egalitarianism is unevenly distributed among people in the U.S. And generally, people in the working class have a higher degree of egalitarianism than people in the middle class, not to speak of people in the upper class. The same thing is true in China. Surveys have been taken there as well, and the same results obtained. But because of the socialist legacy, not an existing socialism, but a legacy nevertheless, people in China tend to have even more egalitarian attitudes than people do in the United States. Again, this is not something that I've established through my own research, but there's been plenty of survey research which has shown this result. And by the way, as to other aspects of egalitarianism, for example, opposition to racism, there is a higher degree of opposition to racism found in China than there is, for example, in the United States or Europe.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Barry, and we really appreciate your contribution, and we look forward to corresponding with you in the future. Okay, our next speaker is Anthony O'Brien. You want to come forward?
Good morning. Amandla. Going to. Freedom is ours. Right? The old cry of the South African anti-apartheid movement. we just chanted that slogan outside of the Wall Street Stock Exchange last Saturday at a conference that was held by our union. I come from the State University of New York, and I'm the secretary of the International Committee of that union. It's a union that represents 27,000 people who work at the university, which has between 250,000 students. So I want to talk about a voice that has been mentioned, but not heard really so far, and that is the voice of the working class in Africa. And I want to combine that idea with the duty of scholars. And in my way of thinking, the duty of scholars is a duty of solidarity with the vast majority of the human race, which I would call the working class. I started the title of the presentation, A Great Humanity of Equal Men. That's a quote from another Du Bois essay, The African Roots of the War, a very perceptive essay about the origins of World War I, published right then. And obviously his notion was a great humanity has to include an Africa which is equally human, if you like. A great humanity of equal men. He issued that call to solidarity in the middle of World War I, which was both over Africa and which, of course, decimated European populations. So I think Du Bois's vision is a world vision, not simply an African or Pan-Africanist or Black consciousness vision. So it's that vision of the great humanity of equal men. So in that spirit, I want to do something rather modest. You might have noticed in the program I'm from an English department, so I'm not going to give you a PowerPoint with lots of data. What I'm doing is presenting partly the research of my colleague and comrade at City University, Emmanuel Ness. And I want to talk a bit about his book. Manny was supposed to be here, but had a family emergency, so I'm presenting his work here. This is a book that I hope you will all run out and get, or at least get a Kindle sample or something. It's called Southern Insurgency. So the author is Emmanuel Ness. His name's actually on your program. The book is Southern Insurgency, The Coming of the Global Working Class. And his notion of the global working class actually has something in common with what Barry Southman was saying. There is a working class, in spite of various European Marxists like Andre Gors and Stanley Aronowitz to tell us that there is no more working class. Barry mentioned the very large Chinese working class. Now, Manny's book starts with the total for the world. He claims 3.1 billion working class people, that is, traditional industrial working class, the industrial working class, manufacturing, mining, transportation, and so forth. Barry was saying almost half of that is in China, but half of it is in the rest of what Manny calls the global south. So his idea of the coming global working class is very similar to Du Bois's idea of the great humanity of equal men. The coming global working class is a working class of the global south. That is the working class that is coming to be, and he includes China in that. We've seen China so far, I think, as a possible counter-imperialist, either a good or a bad or a medium kind of counter-imperialist, or perhaps not imperialist at all, because a lot of the scholarly perspective, I think, that we hear on Africa is completely allied with the neoliberal global order. The scholarship is allied with the capitalist world order. And that's my main message. I'll get back to the concrete stuff in a minute. My main message, which is shared not only by Manny Ness, but by some of the South African scholars I'm going to reference in a minute. My main message is that the only counter to any kind of imperialism or any kind of capitalism, really, is struggle by the global working class. And Southern Insurgency is based on field research in 3 industrial areas in the global south. The first in a Chinese shoe factory, the second in an Indian auto factory, and the third in the South African platinum mine. And he studies in those case studies the persistence of traditional or self-organized working class struggle against the conditions of work, including low wage, including a migrant labor system. Guess what? The coming global working class is a migrant working class. It's a migrant labor system, which is part of keeping it as a low wage system in China, in India, in South Africa. The low wage workers are partly low wage because they are migrants. They are basically forced migrants from their rural homelands, from a place where subsistence agriculture was once outside of the market system, which actually offered, as one of the panelists said this morning, much better nutrition. And Manny's analysis would add much better security and a much better quality of life, including the social, and especially the social relations among people in traditional peasant agriculture. That is shattered. The peasant becomes a proletarian, the worker at home becomes a homeless worker, a migrant worker in the industrial areas. So that is certainly the case in the Chinese industrial production zones, and it's also increasingly the case apparently in India. Most workers in India don't have traditional jobs, they're contract laborers. They're, as we say, precarious or contingent labor. And their contingency, their precarity is heightened by the fact that they're homeless. They have no social ties. They're in a place that might be a shack. It might be part of Mike Davis's planet of slums. The whole working class is becoming more urbanized, more confined in slums. So part of the struggles that when we talk about are not only at the workplace, but in the living space. So the struggles of the coming global working class to become a great humanity of equal men refers not only to equitable, if there are such things, equitable work conditions and wages, but also their living space. So the fact that they're migrants, the fact that they're confined to slums, is very much part of these struggles. This is the case in all three of the areas that Manny studies in China and India and in South Africa. Now, what I want to move to is, excuse me. What I want to move to, and originally I hoped to be able to show you clips from this, is a film, a documentary of the Marikana massacre, August 16th, 2012, in the platinum mining area, Northwest Province, north of Johannesburg, in South Africa. The Marikana massacre is how it's referred to. And the film is called Miners Shut Down. And again, I urge everyone to go immediately and buy this. I know you're not going to do that, so you go immediately to YouTube and look at the the version that pays nothing to the people who make the documentary. But however you do it, see it. Miners Shut Down. And the filmmaker is Rehab Desai. Now, that's an example of art. Remember, a documentary is not simply a window on reality, it's also a shaped work of art. Desai's film comes out of participant observation. He is not only a filmmaker, but an activist. He participated in the Marikana Support Committee. He was there 2 days after the actual massacre in Marikana, along with his comrades who are scholars at the University of Johannesburg Center for Research and Social Change. Rehab lived with, worked with, participated in the popular assemblies, participated in the debates on the side, and was there not just as a person, but as a member of an organized socialist group in South Africa, the Democratic Left Front. So that film conveys two things. It conveys, if you like, both sides of the class struggle. It's a very interesting power structure documentary. It shows, for example, email exchanges between Cyril Ramaphosa, who was once thought to be the successor to Mandela government. He's now worth about $700 million, so he chose that path rather than government service. But he was a shareholder, a considerable shareholder, and on the executive board of London Mining, the imperialist mining company, the old-fashioned imperialist mining company, that collaborated with the government, the Minister of Mines, the Minister of Police, and all of this is documentary evidence introduced at the Government Commission on the Maracaibo Massacre. Ramaphosa and the Minister of Mines agreed the government had to step in here. The basis of that argument was these were not workers, these were criminals. This was not a union, this was a vigilante organization. So they had to step in, and the words of the Minister of Mines, as we see in the document, where we have to step in and to kill it. She did not say we have to kill them. Put that out. She said we have to kill it. Ramaphosa's words were there has to be concomitant action to this understanding of the Maracaibo miners as a criminal organization, which they carried out. The film, however, shows how, coming back to Manny's thesis, shows how the struggle of the coming global working class, the struggle of the workers in the global south, overflows the traditional union structure. Sometimes it works within a union structure and tries to make it an insurgent union, which I would define as a union led by the membership, where the membership is more militant than the leadership of the union. This is not always the case, but certainly in the case of coal miners and the shoe factory workers in China and the Suzuki workers in the Indian auto belt, it was the case. The workers there, and they sometimes they destroyed one union in the minefields, the National Union of Mine Workers, the great union of Cyril Ramaphosa himself, the core union of the SATU, the South African Trade Union Federation, was discredited and essentially driven out of the platinum mining fields because they failed. They failed to stop layoffs. They failed to gain a living wage. They didn't even think of addressing the living places, the informal townships where the miners lived. The film shows workers meeting, discussing, and especially singing. And the struggle of the South African miners is a struggle of singers. This is a struggle of workers who sing. And the best example of it is when they realize they're cornered on the mountain and they have been boxed in by razor wire, by an arrangement of armored cars, by militarized police. By the way, the police had brought 4 mortuary vehicles ahead of time to this confrontation. They had brought vehicles from the morgue that would hold 32 bodies. In the end, they shot down 112 people and 34 died. Half of them died in an original volley of fire. The other half were hunted down as they were trying to escape this area, the copy of the mountain. Hunted down and shot in the back of the head, many of them. So the thing about singing is that when one of the leaders, the popular leaders of the struggle of the Maracaibo miners, realized, he said, their guns are drawn. It's time for us to leave. But we have done nothing to these people. We must not apologize. He said, let us sing as we make our way home. Now, to me, that means, and when you get the film, you'll see it, to me, that means that singing is a marker, if you like, a sign, a reference of struggle itself. And I would take that right back to Du Bois, a great humanity of equal men. Equal men, equal people. I mean, by the way, just on the men thing, that's the old, now outmoded, gender neutral. I mean, imagine the phrase, a great humanity of equal males. doesn't quite work, right? So, but it's men that have that older connotation, doesn't no longer have that. So that great humanity is a general liberation. It's a liberation of the whole person. And I think the singing miner trying to escape the police to go simply to their home, it was a strategic retreat. It was a very good leadership decision made in a large popular assembly of 3,000 miners. Well, they did sing, but they were caught and ambushed. So all of that really more than I wanted to say, but that film is a must-see film. And please, if you see it, think of this idea that the film represents the struggle for a whole liberation of the person. That's what the working class means, a whole liberation of the person, not simply better wages and working conditions. But more quickly, so that's Manny Ness, Southern Insurgency. Apart from Rahad Desai's film, other examples of this kind of solidarity of scholars with workers is an ethnographic account of the Americana, not the massacre, but the Americana movement. It's called The Spirit of Americana, the rise of insurgent trade unionism in South Africa, The Spirit of Americana. And the main author is Luke Singwell, like a movie morality play. Luke Singwell with Sipiwe Lambata. Luke and Sipiwe are part of the Center for Research and Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. People in this field might know Peter Alexander, who's the director. Luke and Sipiwe Lambata and others, and Rahad, and other members of the Democratic Left Front went to Americana immediately. Luke and Sipiwe's project was to tell the story of those miners in their own voices. In other words, it was an oral history collection, it was an ethnographic study, a whole methodology about the questions asked, and so forth. It's a scholarly ethnography. And the book is a magnificent success in that element, at least, that you hear the voice time and time again, almost every page, you hear the voices, not just of the workers in general, and you can hear singing in their thousands in the documentary, but the voice of leaders. His book is really a study of leadership. Who is to be the leadership of the coming global working class? Who is to be the, what ideas and what actual people are to be the leaders of this general liberation of a great humanity? So it's a study of leadership. And almost all of them are migrant workers coming from the Eastern Cape, mostly. They are all chosen by their communities. Some of them had union experience, some of them quickly acquired it. They met every threat. They couldn't really deal with 600 militarized police with automatic weapons, but apart from that, they met every threat and they overcame it. They overcame it not just by fighting, but in words. They overcame it in discourse. They had a counter narrative to every narrative that was thrown at them, whether by the non-men execs or the government or the media. Luke Singwell and Sipiwe Lambata, The Spirit of Americana. Trevor Ngwane is probably some of you well known activist going back to the anti-apartheid period, 20 years or more organizing in the shack dwellers areas, the informal settlements, and he just completed a dissertation at the same center in Johannesburg called Amakomiti, the committees of the, or civics, South Africans sometimes call them. I believe there is a South African colleague here, right?
I used to work
anyway.
there.
Yes?
I used to work there.
The civics, Trevor's contribution to actually aiding the struggle of Americana was to go to implementing one of these informal shanty towns and shack dwellers areas and organized there, where the miners also lived. So Trevor was there as a socialist, as a member of the Democratic Left Front, and as somebody who dissents dissents from the current ruling bloc, or hegemonic bloc, we call it that, in the South African government. And his participation, we haven't read his dissertation yet, but that's the next project. Next time I talk to you, I'll have that one there as well. But there is a new volume of essays called Urban Revolt, edited by these three, Andy Ness, Luke Sidwell, and Trevor Ngwane. Urban Revolt, which is about the organizing in communities. Luke has an essay on Kabashlile, which is one of these informal communities south of Johannesburg. So those three and many others have brought directly through the scholarly medium of writing and publishing from a university, they have brought the voices of the coming global working class into international discussion. I want to end with the thought that this is addressed really to scholars or people who will become scholars. What are the forms of solidarity that scholars can actually embody or create with work? So I think that film, those three books, or those four books, are examples of that. But in each case, note that the scholar is not an observer only, but a participant. These are scholars. Trevor Ngwane was actually in jail when they published Urban Revolt. He was in jail as part of the Tembelishle crisis committee. They had blocked roads and so forth. So these are scholars who are also there. They participate. And that's a model I want to urge, especially on the scholars here, that we have a choice. Here we can unite our work with the global order. We can chip away at it, maybe, but fundamentally, we don't question it. I think one of the preceding speakers in the last panel mentioned that. Economic development, we say, well, he said, as a grad student, and never thought, what actually is that? What is that when it comes down to the humanity of equal men? What is economic development? So scholars can also choose liberation. They can choose the power of the working class. And they can choose that power with the intent to offer something to it, to offer our skill to that. My last point is that as scholars, we are workers, especially in the United States University. I mean, my university, 70% of the teaching is done by people who do not make a living wage, and that's not an exaggeration. They cannot live on the wages for teaching full-time as adjuncts at City University. The unions and others are attempting to correct that, but unfortunately, we don't have the power of the maritime mine workers or other scholars in the professional staff congress at City University. So we are workers. Our workplace is being degraded. We are being totally deprofessionalized as a profession. It's now a low-wage industry, like the mines in South Africa. And the low-wage workers are also migrant workers to a large extent. They're rushing around from campus to campus and place to place. So scholars as workers have an interest in the general liberation and the pursuit of that great humanity. So I just urge all scholars to take that stance and break the neutrality law, which always works in favor of the powerful.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Hassan Wako from the Maastricht University. I'm looking forward to hearing what you've got for us today.
Thank you very much. This is a paper which is part of my PhD dissertation that I'm working on. Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and it has been a long distance to come here, but I'm very happy to be here and share this knowledge on Africa, the West, and China in particular. The first time I saw the call for papers, I was like, this is exactly what I was thinking to name my dissertation on. The three players, the West, China, and Africa. And yeah, I have more chapters coming, but today I'll present something which is very specific and specific to aid. So I will not mention a lot about foreign direct investment or trade relationship. I focus on aid at macro level. And I relate aid to economic growth, which is again a major thing used to judge economic performance of countries, but I'm also related to institutions, as in the respect of property rights, the freedom, liberty, and so on. So this is the outline of the paper, but I will not take much to talk about the methodology. I will just mention briefly that to introduce what I'm going to present, I will not focus, again, this is aid, I will not focus on humanitarian aid, as it sometimes comes to the difference of aid where people criticize aid. Some usually very known famous speakers will say, we are obliged to save lives, but I will not be talking about that part of aid which is given for humanitarian reasons, and I will not be talking about aid which is given for military reasons. I talk about aid which is given for development purposes. Originally argued to help developing countries to accumulate equipments, physical capital, subsequently when that was not more defensible to accumulate human capital in form of education and health, and then to help developing countries to improve their governance and their institutions as they do their businesses. And very recently, to help developing countries acquire some capacity to trade, because now it is more or less believed that trade is superior to aid, and it is argued that developing countries and sub-Saharan African regions, countries in particular, do not have enough to offer unless we help them. But these are the theoretical reasons given, but in practice, aid has been given for a number of other purposes. And there is no doubt, there is no debate that donor interests matter in giving aid. The only debate is to what extent does donor interest matter, and to what extent does the need for a developing country matter in giving aid. I'll move on to a more contentious and more debatable side of it, whether aid has been effective or not. And a lot has been done from 1950s on to convince aid has been working. A lot has been done to criticize that aid is not working at all, or aid is not working as expected. And there are about 4 generations of the aid effectiveness debate, which begin with the aid to investment relationship, and then to aid directly included in growth expressions, growth regressions, to explain the growth differences between countries. But then it's not only aid that causes economic performance, but aid could itself be affected by economic performance of countries. That is why we give aid to poorer countries, poorly performing countries, if that is true. And we have to control for the issue of reverse causality in addressing whether aid is working or not. And finally, recently, we need to open up the black box. We need to see what is happening in between giving aid and looking at the change in economic performance. We call this the intermediary variables, and I particularly focus on institutions as intermediary variables between aid and the sector. And the findings of the debate since the 1950s to the present could be put into 4 camps. The camp which is that aid has been working, it has been effective. There are other reasons why sub-Saharan African countries in particular are not catching up with the rest of the world, as we call it. And this camp has been criticized on methodological grounds, on unsupported hypotheses, And then they started to come up with the conditional effectiveness of aid, particularly from the World Bank, and a famous study by Burnside and Dollard. It says that when aid goes to a country with good economic policy, good institutions, aid could be a midwife to good policy or institutions. Aid could help economies grow when they actually have good policies. For others, it is ineffective. For the other extreme, is not only ineffective, it has caused corruption, it has helped corruption, and it has also contributed to losing competitiveness in the export sector of the European countries through appreciating exchanges. And given the debate, there are three things I would like to contribute to the research gaps. And these relate to the fact that one, not all aid is alike. Aid differs in terms of the sector of destination. Aid given to finance education may not have the same effect as aid given to finance institutional change or trade. And aid given by US may not be the same as aid given by China or Denmark or any other country. And then the second point is again related to heterogeneity differences. The effect of aid is usually measured as the average effect on growth. While aid may influence economic performance of a country in a unique way, than the way it affects the economic performance of another country. So I have to be a bit quicker. And the last point is I would emphasize the intermediary role of institutions, the indirect effect of aid on growth through institutions. And these are the different studies so far. So I was trying to justify that these 3 points have not been adequately addressed: differences between donors, differences between recipients, and the other one is the intermediary role of institutions. And I estimated a dynamic relationship between these 3 variables. I not take much on it. And I like to estimate a longer relationship between aid, institutions, and growth, controlling for possibly short-term or long-term differences between recipient countries. And these are the techniques I use to judge the effectiveness, and these are my variables. Economic growth is measured as the change in real GDP per capita between 2 consecutive years in percentage terms, and the data is from World Bank World Development Indicators. For aid, I use net aid transfers, actual transfers to these countries, which is usually less than the reported in reports of financing countries. From gross aid, I subtract principal repayments, interest repayments, and cancellations of loans which were not originally given for development purposes. And the data comes from Goodman. The updated version is from 2013, I think. And then nutritional quality, I use a measure from an index from the Freedom House, which has a number of things in it: the property right, voice and accountability to the mass, and so on. And I take the average of civil liberties and political freedom and political rights. And the study covers the period from 1980 to 2013, and 43 sub-Saharan African countries are included, and the choice is solely based on availability of data. Some time series properties of the variables I have, and then I run regressions after regressions to look at the relationship between aid from traditional donors at aggregate level, growth, and institutions. And this is the summary of the findings of the regression analysis. Aid from dark donors, from traditional Western donors, has a robust negative effect on institutions. It increases corruption, it reduces accountability to the people, as the governments become more accountable to donors than their own people. As the governments learn to care more about the phone call from the West than the protesters in the roads of the capital cities. And surprisingly, despite the claim that aid is increasing economic growth or financing economic growth, there is a weak evidence that aid is actually contributing to slow down economic growth, even in channels other than institutions. And the lower the economic growth, the poorer the institutions, the more aid countries gain. And aid arguably came in to fight poverty trap, and now we are in poverty aid trap. From poverty to aid and aid to poverty. And then I try to distinguish between different donors. And this is the summary of the findings for the different donors I assessed, about 21 of them from traditional donors group to that group. And we have donors with whose aid has negative effect overall, donors with positive effect, and some in between, neutral or questionable effects, as the growth effect and the institutional effects sometimes conflict with each other. And then I went to the literature on donor quality to try to explain this. And a lot has been done on how donors are different from each other, how they behave in giving aid, and what sectors they give to. And I tried to reconcile my findings with the aid quality literature, donor quality literature, and some of the findings I have are highly consistent, especially for Ireland, Netherlands, and Norway, which perform well in the ranking of donor quality. The aid appears to have a positive effect, so minor in magnitude. For France, Canada, Italy, and Finland, with lots of criticisms in the way they give aid, there is a negative relationship, a negative effect of aid from these countries. Less clear cases are given as 3 lines here. These donors do have some good qualities in the literature. They do also have some poor qualities. So it is possible to justify anything based on what they have as good and what they have as bad. But 2 cases are very difficult to reconcile. One is the case of Denmark, which tops in the rank of almost all donor quality literature. And it happens that the effect of aid from Denmark is neutral. And perhaps that could be due to the small amount of aid it gives, but that should have been the case for some other countries as well. And the other is USA, which in all the donor characteristics is close towards the bottom. It's the bottom 2 or 3, and this aid appears to have a positive growth effect, a negative but not significant institutional effect. So overall, it appears that the aid from US has a positive influence. Again, this cannot be reconciled with the literature on donor quality. But this is what the data says. Then I tried to do the same thing for Chinese aid. And there are some points of note to explain why it's difficult to judge Chinese aid to the same degree as I did for the other donors. And the main point is there is lack of data. But we can't keep on giving lack of data as a reason and try to describe things in non-quantitative things. So I found the data from Australia data for 21 countries in the region, but out of those 21 countries, only 10 do have full-time series data. For others, there are interruptions in the data, missing values. So I did regression only with 10 countries, and the result of the regression could be summarized here. For sure, the economic growth effect of Chinese aid is positive, the direct one, but institutional quality effect is negative. It influences institutions negatively, and the overall effect is therefore difficult to determine. It has good things in terms of growth, bad things in terms of institutions, overall, I couldn't reach a conclusion of whether it is good or bad. But based on growth, it seems better. The other difference is in the cycle. There is a breakdown in the cycle here. Regardless of how a country performs in terms of institutional scores or economic growth, there is no evidence that Chinese aid responds to these variables. Chinese aid doesn't necessarily go to countries with poor performance or good performance. So no systematic difference in aid allocation based on growth and restrictions. These are mainly the points I already raised. And finally, overall, it appears that smaller donors do have aid which is at least better than bigger ones. And one main reason is because they have good donor agency, they do have good transparency, and so on. And if aid has to continue, if we have to rely on aid, then we should focus more on the quality and transparency, selectivity, and so on, rather than trying to push for scaling up aid. And of the quality indicators mentioned, looking at the mixed cases with some positive attributes, donors with some positive and some negative attributes, I reached the conclusion that there are 2 points, 2 measures of donor quality which are more important than others. One is specialization. Countries which tend to give aid to less number of countries do perform better than countries which try to give aid to almost all countries in the world. So countries should focus on financing, donors should focus on financing as few countries or as few projects as possible if they have to help growth and institutional change. The other is alignment. Alignment is the relationship between donor giving behavior and countries' sector of priority. Donors which give more aid in area where the country has identified as a prior area for growth perform better than donors which give aid in a non-allied area or sector. And above all, I'm not very optimistic about the future of aid in financing the development of the region. I would say is despite the differences between new donors and old donors or between among the old donors themselves, it is for Africans to develop Africa, and there is not much hope from aid coming to Africa. And I'm optimistic that the Africans will change given what's happening now in the streets of capitals of Africa recently. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hassan. So we're running a little bit over time, so I thought we'd maybe take 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll be getting ready to go to lunch. So if you have questions for either of the 2 speakers, go ahead and see what you'd like to ask. We have quite a range here between the more literary and the more econometric, so go ahead.
The model for individual pursuits and the effectiveness of aid, agriculture. And for a country like the United States, how do you present something of this sort in models
I do not have data at sectoral level on agriculture, industry, and so on. I do have total aid from different donors, from US and other donors to developing countries in Africa, mostly countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I didn't do for different sectors. I did only refer to aid from US on economic growth of, say, Ethiopia, Kenya, and mostly other countries in Sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah. John Harold.
Thank you. As an African non-native speaker of English language, I have difficulty understanding many issues. Fortunately, I'm happy that a colleague from University of New York speak very English, and for the English partners, can help me with some issues here, and some economists here. Before China went to Africa, there were other economic players. The US, Europe Pacific, United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Portugal and Spain. These were doing economic activities. They were not called interventionists. Now, China is there and it's being described as economic intervention, not investment. Recently, I read from the UK BBC news site that China is planning to build a nuclear power for the United Kingdom. And that is not an intervention. Chinese companies are doing business in America, it is not an intervention. Japanese companies are building cars in America. Go and stand on the road at the roadside. Every 5 minutes you see a Japanese car or German car. That's what it's doing. So I want to know, why did the English language when, how, and why did it evolve? And twist itself around describing Chinese economic activities in Africa as intervention. To me, intervention is like the image of a referee in boxing match who intervenes when one person is going to be in trouble or is going to be killed. Now, I would say that the media should probably call it what it is, not only for the Chinese, but for all of the West going into Africa. It is not economic intervention. It is economic interference. It is economic disruption. It is economic destabilization. But then, as I said, I'm not an English language speaker, and I struggle to understand and use the English language. Therefore, I will call upon the economists to tell me what they mean by intervention, and for the English to tell me what they mean by intervention. Thank you.
I think we will defer that discussion until lunchtime. We can really get at it. Okay. One more question, if anybody gets in the back.
My question is addressed to Hassan. You mentioned that you modeled the two conclusions you made about institutions. The effect of aid on institutions was negative, or the correlated negative. How is that explained theoretically or even empirically? What is the deeper analysis of your findings? Secondly, when you see aid, there are three arguments: the foreign exchange gap, the savings gap, and the fiscal gap. So there are some donors who are reverting to the direct budget support, and we are witnessing that there is some change, positive change in that regard. So how do you model that physical gap in your analysis? And final one is the question of predictability. The Western, the dark donors commit resources for a certain period of time, as opposed to China. So how do you model predictability? Because ex ante and ex post effects of aid are very different. And Chinese aid comes as a surprise, which you cannot predict on, financing your project. So if you can comment on those.
Okay, the first question relates to the explanation for the negative decision effects of aid. And I think you explicitly asked if, what is the mechanism through which aid will affect institutions negatively. So the higher the degree of dependency of the recipient country on aid, So less likely if the government will respond to the needs of the population, and the more it responds to the interests of the donor countries or funds from the donor countries. So it's possible to go forward, but one thing I say is through eroding voice and accountability of the local population, aid will lead to lower decisional qualities for farmers. And of course, aid is also given partly to countries some months ahead of announcing some foreign direct investments. So it's like it could be a way of adapting governments to reform institutions in a way suitable for multinational corporations. The second one is about predictability of aid, and it's possible that more predictable aid could be good if the country could rely on aid from a particular source and finance certain projects. And unpredictable aid could burden countries with the capacity to allocate it if they are not ready for it. But the evidence isn't in favor of either more predictable aid being more effective or not. One of the examples is the case of aid from Germany, which is one of the most predictable aids, but its seasonal quality effect is still negative, or its growth effect is still negative. So I don't see any one-to-one relationship between predictability and effectiveness of aid, either in terms of economic growth and institutions. I'll ask you to repeat the other question.
The effect of aid on government, to be explicit, on government consumption, because the more aid you give, the more consumed the governments consume. And the question of aid tangibility and issues like that, rather than putting money on real investment, real growth, governments tend to consume a lot. So have you looked at the effect of aid on government consumption?
Okay, I do look at the effect of aid on government consumption, but related to this a bit, I looked at if the effect of aid on growth or institutions depends on the level of government consumption in the country. And I couldn't see any evidence that the effect of aid on institutions varies between countries with high government consumption and low government consumption. But to be to the point of your question, I can test the effect on tangibility of government consumption.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. Let's give them a round of applause. Okay, so we're now moving on to lunch. Be sure you have your blue ticket, and it's upstairs in the East Ballroom. See you there in a couple of minutes.
Oh man, I'm like the only one here.
Oh, okay. I was here. So there is
Then mix it. Yeah, it should be. It should be.
Yeah. I find out this.
Maybe, yeah, we'll try for I'll just like